In my video introducing the L model of life and love, I made the claim that most double standards we observe in the ways men and women are treated are actually reverse standards. And I defined this as the same standard being applied to men and women but in opposite ways, like two sides of the same coin. This is one of the many things I considered worthy of its own video, so I thought this one would be a nice follow-up. The logic of reversing them can be applied to a lot of different double standards, I believe, so I might turn this into a series. But for now, let's start with the most famous example of a double standard, because we've all heard it a million times from girl power and men's activists alike. There is an obvious double standard when it comes to how we judge a given human being who is promiscuous. A woman who has a lot of bedroom fun is deemed a slut, that is a negative. A man who does the same as stud, that is a positive. Or if you prefer, use the more modern terms alpha or Chad. The easily outraged will frame this as an example of women being oppressed by society. The not easily outraged but intellectually lazy will acknowledge the double standard in an it-is-what-it-is manner, but without questioning where it comes from. The funny witty ones do indeed have an explanation ready, though most of them frame it in terms of a metaphor. That a key which can open any lock is a pretty awesome key, but a lock which can be opened by any key is just a particularly terrible kind of lock. Now, this works to quickly justify the double standard with common sense in a pinch, but it still doesn't actually explain where it comes from. Why should anyone accept the premise that men have keys and women have locks, just because of the remote similarity between those things and the respective genitals? Fortunately, there have been quite a few content creators in the manosphere who have delved a little deeper into the evolutionary origin of this double standard. And those explanations will of course show up in this video too. However, what I haven't seen anyone acknowledge yet is that there is indeed a second side to this particular double standard as well, in which the woman is applauded for the same type of behavior that is frowned upon in a man. And that is that a chaste woman is considered virtuous, saving herself up for the right one, whereas for a chaste man we immediately tend to assume that he can't get laid. And this is not just some random whataboutism, but indeed the second side of the coin, frequency of bedroom activity. So it's really amazing to me nobody has brought this up yet. You would think that if the slut-stud dichotomy is how we judge highly promiscuous behavior between men and women, then more people would ask, well, how do we judge low promiscuous behavior between men and women in comparison? The slut-stud dichotomy has been theorized by other manosphere content creators to arise from the respective evolutionary tasks men and women have. So I will briefly outline those and then expand the explanation so that the reverse standard of the virtuous female virgin and the creepy male incel can be covered by it as well. For a guy, having lots of sexual partners is obviously perceived as a mark of success, because from a genetic standpoint, that's precisely what it is. He has the opportunities to spread his genes far and wide. Sure, a child he puts personal investment into raising and providing with resources, a child he personally protects from harm, that kid has a much higher chance of survival than all those kids he only sired and possibly never even met in person. Think of a medieval king who had maybe one or two legitimate sons and then lots of bastards scattered across his kingdom. But there is no downside to him personally in siring these additional children, it's just an added benefit on top. Maybe a few of them will survive, maybe many of them won't. Genes don't care about individuals. The worst case scenario for a guy is therefore if he can't get a single opportunity to spread his genes, because that means they will die out together with him. Since the prerequisite for spreading his genes is being selected by a woman, unless he decides to cheat at that game, which is probably why human beings evolved to morally condemn this kind of behavior, the guy who fails to be selected as a mate is the least successful and thus least valued by society. Since women, however, are the bottleneck of human reproduction, meaning they produce much fewer eggs than men produce sperm, and can also usually only carry one, maybe two children at the same time, there is little evolutionary gain for a woman's genes if she sleeps with lots of different men. On the contrary, the more men she is intimate with, the more of them could potentially be the father of the kid she ends up pregnant with. Potentially the guy with the best genes, but maybe also the guy with the worst genes among those males she slept with. So the much safer option is only mating with the guy who has the best genes in the first place. She can still benefit from the sexual interest of the other males by playing with their hopes, teasing them, getting them to do all kinds of favors for her, but she has every reason to be reluctant to actually fulfill those hopes of giving them reproductive access. If she isn't selective enough in this regard, if she grants several men a shot at procreating with her, she might give birth to a less than genetically optimal child. With optimal not being the same as perfect, it just means the best that's currently possible. And several partners dilute the chances of the child having the best genes it could have. In other words, too many cooks spoil the broth. Granted, being voluntarily promiscuous once pregnancy has begun may serve to protect the child once it has been born. And the birth control pill kind of simulates a pregnancy, so maybe this plays a role in increased promiscuity in our modern day and age as well. Not just the fact that it prevents actual pregnancies and thereby eliminates a lot of consequences that would normally arise from promiscuous behavior. I'm specifically referring to how hormones might be affecting behavior here. I have heard, for example, that if you take a steed out of a group of horses and have a stallion from another one impregnate her, she will mate with every stallion in her own group once she's back, so that every male has a reason to assume he could plausibly be the father of the offspring she gives birth to in the end. In other animal species, such as certain monkeys, it is even not uncommon for males to kill the offspring of earlier male partners the same female had, because apparently if the ape mother is no longer breastfeeding the children sired by another male, she will become fertile again more quickly. Thus, mating with several males to make each of them think they could be the father will at least give each of those males an incentive to protect the offspring of that female. Or, even more importantly, it might prevent those males from straight up killing her offspring. However, while making several partners emotionally attached to her can work to give them all a reason to protect her child, it might also do the opposite. There is a phenomenon in psychology known as diffusion of responsibility, which basically means the more different people could potentially help with something, the less each individual feels the pressure that they in particular have to be the one to pick up the slack. In this case, this would mean that none of the guys commits to her as a long-term partner. The promiscuous woman therefore does not only fail at being sufficiently selective in evolutionary terms, she also fails at securing a man's commitment, which would be essential to both her own and her child's survival, since at least during the late months of pregnancy and the first months after that, she will have to rely on a man as a protector and provider for both herself and the kid. Therefore, the worst case scenario for a woman is not being selective enough, and or not having a man at her side to take care of her and any children she might possibly be expecting. And this worst case scenario of course can also arise if this power of selectivity is taken from her, which is why women evolve to respond to such events with trauma, I would assume. Let's slightly modify and expand this double standard and make it a little more complex. Now we're removing those people who generally can't get any romantic or sexual action from the picture, since for them the story kind of ends there, and zoom in on those who can, but have different levels of availability. When we speak of availability, we need to split it up into availability for bedroom fun and availability for relationships, that is, commitment, because those are the respective bargaining chips for the two genders. The main evolutionary feature that women offer is reproductive access, which is basically nothing more but also nothing less than a gateway to immortality, to quote myself from my song Messenger. But of course it's only immortality for genes, not individuals. The main thing that men have to offer is their commitment, and then of course all the services they can perform for a woman once they're committed to her. Protection is one part of that, provision is another, and in the modern context the latter equals money. Or if you want to put it more cynically, men want to get into women's pants and women want to get into men's wallets. The slut gives her bargaining chip away too easily because she offers reproductive access to somebody who hasn't necessarily proven himself worthy of that yet. The simp in turn gives his bargaining chip away too easily because he offers his commitment to somebody who hasn't necessarily proven herself worthy of that yet either. The guy who falls in love too easily, who pledges his loyalty to a woman too easily without her having earned it, he is essentially a commitment slut. In turn, a lone wolf type of guy, with wolf implying the physical and mental strength that makes him attractive as a sexual partner for women in general, well, because he is a lone wolf, that means he is hard to tie down. His commitment is worth much more than that of the simp, simply because it's much harder to obtain. Scarcity creates value because the supply of commitment he offers is lower than the demand on the female side. And a woman who has high standards for who she sleeps with, I'm calling this a sexual fortress for lack of a better term, increases the value of her own bargaining chip as well. She can hold it up more as a prize for the guy to strive for, so when he finally does get it, he will perceive it as much more rewarding. That's just delayed gratification. Now, of course, there is a sweet spot to both sides. If a woman dangles the carrot of reproductive access in front of a man's nose for too long, that is, she's leading him on, or a guy promises his commitment to a woman as they're meeting over and over again for casual bedroom gymnastics, at some point the respective other partner will start considering this nothing but an empty promise. With that in mind, let's return to this overview. I think the explanation I just gave illustrates why the slut and the simp are viewed as negative, whereas the fortress and the lone wolf are desirable. So let's focus on the remaining ones now. A guy who is often and readily available for bedroom gymnastics, well, that's just considered normal for men. A stud is simply someone who is getting that desire fulfilled a lot, and that could potentially be with one and the same partner, or if the stud overlaps with the lone wolf, that would place him at peak desirability. A guy who shows no frequent interest in bedroom gymnastics, in contrast, neither fits our societal expectations of men nor everyday biology knowledge, because of course the average levels of libido for men are much higher than for women. So even if he's in a state of what guys going their own way would call intellectually induced asexuality, most people will still just assume he can't get it up. In turn, a woman being available for relationships in the sense that she has romantic ambitions and finding a partner is one of her main priorities in life, not that she would simply fall for anyone, well, that would be the default assumption, just like a guy being interested in getting the poison out. And that default assumption is of course also fulfilled if a given woman already has a partner when you first meet her. After all, that's even more of a proof how much priority she gives to this goal. A woman, however, who explicitly wants to remain single, having her fun first and maybe settling down later, ignoring the ticking of the biological clock and doing so, well, a lot of people would probably regard this as immature, no matter how much certain modern-day movements want to reframe this behavior as empowering. Here is one more, focusing on the provider part now, or as we could also put it, commitment to already existing children. Girl power advocates will often complain about how a woman who spends a lot of time at work and focuses on her career will be considered a callous mother if she already has kids. Whereas a guy who does the same will be regarded as responsible since he's putting in more hours now to take care of the family. These activists therefore often demand that men should take on more of the domestic responsibilities. Yet at the same time, they fail to see how TV shows, ads, and other types of media output made by people who share their philosophy will portray fathers who are trying to take care of the kids as useless buffoons who fail at this task in epic proportions, with only mommy being the one who holds everything together at home, and possibly still manages to advance her career at the same time. The latter is what they want to enable and see more frequently, of course, but then they would have to cleverly market the caretaking tasks to men as well, by portraying them as something they would both enjoy and be competent at. That's enough different double standards for one video, I believe. Now we move on to my attempt at ascribing the societal hierarchy that results from this. Where do you end up in terms of desirability and respect, depending on what category society puts you into? At the top will always be the top 10 to 20% of guys. Since 80% of women are attracted to these men, they have their free pick. They can afford to be as choosy with women as most women are with the majority of men. This also means that to these top guys, women are as expendable as the remaining 80% of men are to women. One could say, once you've made it to this very top as a guy, you get many of the advantages of being a woman actually, without getting any of the biological and societal downsides. That's why these guys are the prizes for women, the ones that every girl is trying to secure for herself. Men, meanwhile, as we know, will be on the lookout for the youngest, in brackets legal, women, since they have the highest fertility and come with the least emotional baggage, most of all an intact pair bonding mechanism. These are the girls with still somewhat intact, somewhat naive hopes and dreams about relationships, which basically means they are the princesses waiting for their own personal Prince Charming to show up and lead them into their happily ever after. As you can see, I've labeled the two prize categories in gold here. Now, the reason why the female virgins aren't in second place, but only in third, is that virginity is not something a woman can strive for. She can only keep it until she eventually loses it. Whereas wealth, power, and status are indeed things men can strive for, and usually have to as well, because unless you're born into a high-class family, nobody gets that stuff for free. So what's the thing that a woman can strive to achieve for herself? Well, marriage and motherhood, obviously. That's why the faithful wife is above the female virgin here, because that is what said female virgin would generally be expected to be striving for, at least according to the conservative ideal. At the same time, the most desired individuals of each gender will still be the two categories labeled in gold. That is, the high-status guys with lots of potential partners to choose from, and the young, non-promiscuous women. Or to put it in a short and catchy phrase, men must deserve their value, women must preserve their value. Below that comes the better provider. He will receive a certain amount of respect for having made it in terms of establishing his own family, but at the same time his efforts are also largely taken for granted. He's the reliable bedrock, but nothing to write home about. At the very bottom you have the highly sexually active women and the sexually inactive men, the sluts and the incels. Now I've placed the sluts slightly higher because men may still find a slut attractive, even if only for one bedroom session at a time. The male equivalent, however, has nothing attractive about him, neither romantically nor sexually. And I use the word equivalent here deliberately, meaning of equal value, because it's obviously not the same thing. Now, what girl power advocates did, among others, is trying to elevate the uncommitted and possibly promiscuous woman while denigrating the role of the stable male provider for the family. Sure, they will also denigrate the promiscuous uncommitted guy, but it's much harder for them to make society stop perceiving him as a winner, and even if for no other reason than that it has become glaringly obvious a couple of years ago what most women actually think about the guys at the very top. Likewise, the social engineers also won't be able to shame men into preferring a promiscuous woman over a sexually less experienced one when it comes to selecting a long-term partner. And it's not just about the ego boost of a guy priding himself of being the very first one she is intimate with, it's also because these women tend to come with less emotional baggage, a more innocent, childlike optimism. Sure, there will always be naivety attached to that as well, but most guys would probably prefer a naive and happy girlfriend over a cynical and disillusioned one. And of course, a lot of women still strive to become mothers and have a family eventually once they decide to settle down. But until then, The independent and promiscuous lifestyle is possible, and it's something that has been championed for women, whereas the role of the stable family provider is no longer something that appeals to guys as much as it used to, simply because there's little respect given to that role anymore, it seems. The involuntary celibates, as I said before, have always been at the bottom, and even if there are other types of men who choose to remain bachelors for different reasons, that doesn't fit the societal or biological default, so they just get lumped in that category as well. After all, categories serve the evolutionary purpose of making the world easier to explain for us, and you can only have so many different ones to work with before you start losing the overview. In the end, all these questions about how we judge men and women differently for their romantic and sexual behavior come down to one question. Are you doing your part in helping our tribe survive? The slut fails both at securing a guy's commitment, for a provider, and at selecting, that is, restricting herself to one specific partner who she deems to have the best genes. As a result, she will be a burden on the tribe because she might give birth to a child that isn't as well equipped genetically as it could have been if she had restrained herself, but also because if no guy has committed to her and thus no possible provider feels responsible for taking care of her and her kids, this burden will fall on the tribe as a whole. In modern societies, where this is done via state-funded special programs for single mothers, this burden on the entire tribe is of course less apparent than in caveman days, when it would have been the much more tangible question of who is willing to share his mammoth meat with her and her kids, but the burden on society as a whole still exists. The simp, in contrast, mainly just wastes his own resources by committing to a woman and spending money on her without getting what he actually wants in return. But of course, these resources could be better used elsewhere, where they might fulfill a more worthwhile purpose than temporarily inflating a girl's ego. The involuntary celibate is at the very bottom of society because he can neither get reproductive access nor commitment. Thus, his genes have no chance of survival anyway and will simply die as soon as he does, whenever that may be. Until then, he is just an additional mouth consuming resources. So unless he makes some great invention or other type of advancement that benefits the tribe as a whole, they will not be pleased about the idea of having to share their resources with him. They basically even have a reason to ostracize him and force him out of the tribe should the opportunity arise. Ultimately, it's our historic inability to control procreation that created these standards, and the mere fact that we have recently become able to fairly reliably disconnect procreation from bedroom gymnastics doesn't change our instincts. Consequently, none of us will be able to escape the resulting judgments either. You can stress 1,000 times that you are single and celibate by choice. Most people simply won't believe you and will immediately jump to conclusions about it being a coping mechanism merely designed to hide that you can't get any action. Because a guy who is genuinely no longer interested in horizontal entertainment is not an evolutionarily viable strategy, just like a woman who doesn't want children. Because even if her biology can force her to have them, if she has no personal interest in taking care of them, which would mean their death in a natural environment, her bloodline will just as easily come to an end. Thus, you won't be able to escape the judgment, but that doesn't mean you can't still make the decision to escape from the game of evolution itself. My song Awake, as some of you already know, describes precisely this initial burst of rage that comes with the insights into the rules of evolution, but ultimately allows to break out of this genetic autopilot mode. Another song of mine, called Untamed, which I haven't referenced yet so far, describes a slightly later point in time where the insights into the rules of the evolutionary game have already been achieved, and now it's about their practical application. Specifically, the realization that you will have to choose between pursuing a personal goal or continuing to go along with the biological imperative despite being aware of the mechanisms. It basically describes the choice between the red and the purple pill. The comfortable ignorance of the blue pill is no longer an option at this point, and ultimately goes with the red one. That's it for this video. As always, feel free to disprove my claims in the comments down below, and see you all next time.